Hey everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Gut Health Dialogues. I'm so excited to dive into today's topic because honestly, the low FODMAP diet is one of the most effective tools I've ever used to help people feel better fast. It's truly been a game changer for the majority of my patients, and I know it has the potential to make a huge difference for many of you as well. Purpose of this episode is to give you a truly comprehensive introduction to the low FODMAP diet. If you've never even heard of it before, you're in the right place because we're starting with the basics. But I also know that many of you listening are already familiar with this diet. Maybe you've tried it in the past, or you're currently following it. Maybe you've been on it a long time. Even so, I'll bet you're going to learn something new today because we are covering it all. We're going to break down what the low FODMAP diet is, what it means, the science behind it, who it helps, and how it works. Plus, I'll be sharing tips and tricks to make it easier, common pitfalls to avoid, and much, much more. And to top it all off, I have an exciting free gift to share with you. Something that's already helped so many people hit the ground running and start feeling better almost instantly. Not kidding. So go ahead and download that gift. It's in the show notes. It's the 30-day low FODMAP meal plan. And it gives you, yes, you heard it, 30 days of complete meal plans, breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snacks that are low FODMAP. So you can just set and forget, also with the grocery list for each week. So if you are overwhelmed with the learning curve of this diet, this allows you to just hit the ground running while you're learning the nuances so that you can ultimately implement it yourself and choose your own meals. That way you don't have to wait to start feeling better. And I'm super excited about that. So download it. It's in the show notes, the 30-day low FODMAP meal plan. Let's dive in, you guys. So first of all, what is IBS? And how does the low FODMAP diet help? IBS is the diagnosis of exclusion. So it really can mean many different things as far as what's the actual mechanism, why are you having symptoms? It can be many different reasons. Aren't super well understood or straightforward from a standard perspective, meaning a lot of diseases or health conditions, they'll correlate with very specific lab values that'll be elevated or specific structural issues that will show up a certain way. IBS is not like that. IBS is a condition where those things just aren't present. Your blood work looks fantastic, or it can. So there's no specific blood markers that can tell us, yes, you have IBS. That your colonoscopy can look whistle clean, perfect, and yet you could be suffering terribly. You could even not be able to leave the house, maybe because of tremendous gas or urgent diarrhea where you can barely make it to the bathroom. The other weird thing about IBS is it can be totally different. So you might be thinking, that doesn't sound like me. I'm constipated. Guess what? You could still have IBS. The presentation can be totally opposite from one person to the next. So it's a very interesting space. So let's talk about how it's technically classified. So we have IBS-C, constipation predominant, IBS-D, diarrhea predominant, and then there's IBS-M, where you have a mix alternating between constipation and diarrhea. Alongside that, you can have any or all of the following: abdominal pain, bloating, and gas, and sometimes other GI symptoms as well. So it's very individual from person to person. Now, FODMAPs, where do FODMAPs come in? And I should say that FODMAPs don't just affect people with IBS. We do see the low FODMAP diet is helpful for lots of different digestive conditions. FODMAPs, let's start with, what are they? FODMAP is an acronym, very obnoxious acronym, stands for fermentable oligodiene monosaccharides and polyols. And those are names for different, very specific carbohydrates that are in many different plant foods. When you hear carbohydrates, we're not talking about carbs. So we're not saying this is a low carb diet. In fact, many of the high FODMAP foods are very low in carbs because they can be in vegetables like cauliflower and snap peas. They are in those two vegetables, but those are low carb vegetables. So it's about the type of carbohydrate. And the thing about these FODMAPs is they are the favorite food of bacteria, which in a healthy, well-functioning digestive tract, that's a good thing. FODMAPs are actually a good thing. They're actually what feed, for the most part, are a diverse, healthy microbiome of all these different kinds of good bacteria that we need in our gut to be healthy. But the problem is when you have an imbalance of bacteria, when you have a microbiome issue, and we see that with, I'm just going to say most people with IBS. Here's why I say that. 60 to 80% of people with IBS, we know this from the research, have SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, which is a bacterial overgrowth in the small intestine where we're not supposed to have any bacteria, negligible amounts. We're supposed to house all of our bacteria in the large intestine. So 60 to 80% of people with IBS actually have SIBO, and most of them don't know it. Okay, so if this is like news to you, look into that. I do highly recommend if you have IBS or these IBS symptoms, maybe your IBS hasn't been diagnosed, but if you're having these symptoms, certainly get tested for SIBO. But 60 to 80% have a bacterial overgrowth in the small intestine, and then many of those also or instead have a bacterial overgrowth in the large intestine, and that's called dysbiosis. And I find this is true. So that pretty much adds up to the majority. And I find that in my clinical practice, even people who don't have SIBO, when we test them for dysbiosis, they have that. So with IBS, it's not all cases of IBS, because sometimes it can be something like exocrine pancreatic insufficiency, where you could be having urgent diarrhea every day, and it's not your microbiome. It could be like you're not producing enough pancreatic enzymes, or it could be you're not producing or you're not reabsorbing your bile, so you're having bile acid diarrhea. So it's not 100%, but it's most that have this as at least part of what's going on. And so this is why most people see significant improvement with the low FODMAP diet when it's implemented correctly, because FODMAPs are the favorite food of bacteria, and bacterial overgrowth is the case with most people with IBS. So think of FODMAPs as the fuel that your gut bacteria ferment. For those with IBS, this fuel can lead to an overreaction, like a fire going off. So the science behind the low FODMAP diet, it was developed by the researchers at Monash University, which is a university in Australia. And it has become a proven first-line therapy for IBS. Studies show that it can reduce IBS symptoms in up to 75% of IBS sufferers. So the thing is, though, it's meant to be temporary as far as the diet itself, or the elimination portion itself. So we'll talk more about that in a second, but the low FODMAP diet is a process. It's not an end-all be-all diet plan. And we'll get into that in depth in a few minutes. So basically, by temporarily eliminating high FODMAP foods and then reintroducing them systematically, it helps you to identify what your specific triggers are. And like I say, I use it with my patients alongside other things that we're doing to rebalance the gut. And we'll talk about that too, just a little bit, but it's not meant to be a permanent restriction. And that's something that you'll notice as a concern. So if you've ever looked at the diet, I'm just using air quotes here when I say diet, because that is a four-letter word for so many dietitians. And I feel the same way. We hate the word diet, and yet that's in our name, because diet really just means what you eat. And yet I'm going to use the word, even though I don't like it, because really it's an eating plan and it's a process, but it helps you. It's not meant to be permanent restriction. It's actually about gaining control and confidence over your food choices. So let me talk real quick though, because I keep talking about IBS. That is originally where it was found to be the most helpful and developed for, but because of what I just explained about why it helps in people who have bacterial overgrowth, we're finding it helpful with other conditions, and the research is finding that as well. So we're finding that it can be helpful in SIBO, which I mentioned a little bit already, and also IBD, inflammatory bowel disease. So people with inflammatory bowel disease, a lot of times, especially if they're not responding well to some of the standard treatments, that just increases the likelihood that they actually have maybe SIBO or some other imbalance alongside the issue. And this is really important to understand. So if you're listening and you have inflammatory bowel disease like colitis or even celiac or Crohn's disease. I actually have a patient right now. She was diagnosed with celiac disease a year ago, and she went off gluten. And when you're diagnosed with celiac disease, the only solution is going completely gluten-free. And then it can take months and months and months for your gut to truly heal, even once gluten is eradicated. She gave it that time, but now fast forward a year later, she is still really symptomatic. I think she saw initial improvement, but then her symptoms came back. And a lot of times in that case, it's yes, you have celiac disease, or yes, you have Crohn's or colitis. And so it's so common for practitioners to just look at what we know you have and just keep hammering away at different ways to address that. But there could be more to the picture. Our guts are complex. And a lot of times, if you're just not responding to any treatments, think about your microbiome and you may have an imbalance there. And so with this patient, we did stool testing and found that she does have an imbalance. She has dysbiosis in her large intestine and she has tremendous SIBO, like her SIBO gas levels are literally off the charts. Like it just, the Genova SIBO test I used says, it just says over 81 as the highest level gas level. So that's just what it says for the methane. So she has tremendous overgrowth in her gut, and that's what we're going to be addressing to finally get her feeling better alongside the gluten-free diet. In the meantime, we're also implementing the low FODMAP diet. So you can have bacterial imbalance with these other issues, and therefore the low FODMAP diet can be very helpful. Let's talk about the phases of the low FODMAP diet. There are three phases. There's the elimination phase, and that's where we remove all high FODMAP foods to reduce symptoms, especially bloating, abdominal discomfort, and gas. And this phase, it not only gives us the quick relief that everybody's looking for, but it also gives us a stable baseline then to proceed to the next phase of reintroduction. So the second phase, once we see that symptom relief, and the elimination phase is supposed to last anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks. Truly, I have had people see like all their symptoms disappear on day 2 or 3. I've seen that, but then other people, it takes a little more time. So it truly can happen very dramatically and very quickly. I do recommend making good notes about what your symptoms are like before so that you can notice and track your improvement. But we say 2 to 6 weeks. So you want to definitely at least give it a solid 2 weeks. And 6 weeks can be helpful because there's a learning curve. And this is the most complex diet plan I've ever worked with. There are so many nuances to it. And a low fat diet is pretty intuitive. You know, in general, what foods are higher fat, what foods are lower fat, just as an example. But the low FODMAP diet, it seems very random. So there's a learning curve. Luckily, we have a tremendous number of tools out there, which I'll share with you. But there's a lot to it. So that's where the 6 weeks can come in because we don't want to expect ourselves to be perfect right out the gates. That's overwhelming and that's not realistic. So give yourself the time to ease into the diet. And then by the 6 week point, you want to make sure that those last 2 weeks, you got a really good, clean 2 weeks once you've learned enough to be able to do that. Or you can follow the meal plan that I have for you in the show notes to a T, and it'll give you a solid 4 weeks. So at the end of the elimination phase, the goal is to see number one, how much improvement am I going to see with this at its best? And then number two, to have a stable baseline from day to day so that when you start reintroducing foods, it'll be clear if the foods are causing you an issue or not. If you're still having big swings in your symptoms from one day to the next, you're not ready to reintroduce because you wouldn't know if it's actually the food that you're reintroducing causing you a problem or if this is just a swing that you're having. So once you're ready to move on to the reintroduction phase, that's when you're going to gradually reintroduce FODMAP groups one at a time to identify your personal triggers, monitoring symptoms carefully to determine your tolerance levels. And I'm doing a whole separate episode on the reintroduction phase, so I'm not going to go into it too much now. There's a whole system to it, and we're going to put that in another episode really soon. So stay tuned for that. Today, we'll focus more on the elimination phase. But then there's a third phase called the personalization phase, and that's where you use the information that you've gleaned from the reintroduction phase to develop a sustainable longer term eating plan based on your tolerance. And the goal is to reintroduce as many foods as possible while still avoiding your triggers and still maintaining that low or no baseline of symptoms. We're going to get into the elimination phase. And basically, the foods to avoid. FODMAPs are in all of the different plant foods, and they're in just about every food group. So within every food group of plant foods, there are some foods that are high in FODMAP and some foods that are low in FODMAP. So we're just going to go through in general, and then I recommend anyone who's really serious about following this to download two different apps. Number one is definitely the Monash University Low FODMAP app, because that is the ultimate source. They're the ones doing the research, they're the ones that develop the diet, and they're continuing to research and update the information. One of the other complaints a lot of people have about the low FODMAP diet is when you go online, you can look at three different sources and get conflicting information. And that's a lot of reasons for that. The reasons basically are number one, the research is always evolving. And so things can change. We've had foods that we thought we learned they're high FODMAP and vice versa. So the research is developing and not everyone's updating their materials constantly. The other thing is this is a very nuanced diet. And let's say in the doctor's office, I know when I first started working with the diet 11 years ago, working out of different gastroenterology offices, we gave people a one-page handout. And some of you are familiar with this one-pager low FODMAP diet. There's your diet on one page. And so when we're oversimplifying a very nuanced situation, it can look different. For example, avocados. Technically, 1/8 of an avocado is low FODMAP, but who's going to open up an avocado to get 1/8? Some people might, other people it's not worth it. And if I'm putting this information on a one pager, I'm just going to say it's a no, it's on your no list, because I don't have room to explain the nuances of, okay, you can actually have 1/8. Another example is garbanzo bean. Basically, all beans are naturally high in FODMAP at any reasonable serving that you would eat. But actually, if you ate a tablespoon or two of many beans, that amount is low FODMAP, because that amount's not enough to cause symptoms for most people. And also, with beans, certain beans have been studied. So garbanzo beans, lentils have been studied, canned, drained, and rinsed. And if they're produced that way, in comparison to if you boiled the beans at home and you cook them at home and they still have all of their FODMAPs in them, when they're canned, the FODMAP component leaches into the water and then it can be rinsed and drained away. Canned beans and the ones that have been tested are the garbanzos and lentils. When you drain them and rinse them, they are low FODMAP in a quarter cup portion. But if I'm trying to put all this on a one-page handout, I'm just going to put all beans in the no list. So this is another reason that we see conflicting information. So the Monash app breaks it down for you. It'll tell you, okay, Brussels sprouts is another one. I think you can have one Brussels sprout. Don't quote me on that, but it's something like that, one or a half. And the Monash app will tell you exactly how much you can have of the different foods, and it gives you a green light, yellow light, red light system. So I do recommend using that as your primary source of a food lookup. If you're wondering, okay, what about carrots? What about broccoli? What about Brussels sprouts? What about apples? Other thing about this diet is there are nuances to ingredients. So are a lot of sneaky ingredients. Sneaky not because any food companies are trying to be sneaky, but just sneaky because there are high FODMAP ingredients that you might not realize are in a lot of foods. So for example, you might learn that gluten-free foods are good. So gluten-free foods are good, are generally recommended on the low FODMAP diet because wheat is high FODMAP. It has something called fructan in it, which is a high FODMAP ingredient. So let's say that you decide that gluten-free bread is okay and you go buy one. It could have other high FODMAP ingredients. It could have honey. It could have molasses. So it could have added fiber additives like inulin in there. So it can make you crazy trying to read labels and figure out all of these ingredients. And even if you knew what all of them were, it's just a lot. So I recommend the Spoonful app. The Spoonful app will scan grocery products and it'll flag if there are high FODMAP ingredients. So it's just a huge game changer. I started getting tremendously better results once the Spoonful app came out because a lot of people, okay, they were cutting out the onions, they were cutting out the apples, but there were just a lot of high FODMAP ingredients sneaking into their diet, and none of us could really get control of it until they started with this app. So I highly recommend that. It's a grocery search and scan. You can search grocery products in there and you can scan them as well. So those are your resources to get more info, but I'll give you a broad overview right now. So FODMAPs, they're only in plant foods and dairy, and they're carbohydrates that bacteria like to eat and ferment. So we have four different primary categories, and then we have some subcategories, totaling to seven categories total. So we have the four primary are lactose, foods with excess fructose, fructans, different from fructose, fructans, and polyols. And then the polyols breaks down into two subcategories that can react differently for different people. That's mannitol and sorbitol. And for reintroduction purposes, gluten is one of them. We separate that out and test that separately because some people can have specific reactions to gluten that they don't have to other fructans. And then there are vegetables and fruits that contain fructans. And then there's GOS, which is galacto-oligosaccharides, and those are your beans and legumes. And then fructose, I just want to say with the fructose category, all fruits have fructose, right? But not all fruits are high FODMAP. So the fructose is actually excess fructose. When fructose and glucose are present in equal amounts in a food, the fructose hitches a ride with the glucose and it's absorbed readily. So it's not in the gut very long to feed bacteria and cause a problem. But excess fructose, where the glucose is absorbed, but there's extra fructose, it hangs around in the gut longer, and that is very slow to absorb. So it hangs out in the gut, feeds bacteria, they have a party, and you get lots of gas production and symptoms from that. Okay, so let's talk about then the different food groups, and I'll just give you a few examples in each food group. So I broke down the FODMAP categories, but so you can just wrap your head around it. I'll also go through food groups. So with vegetables, there are some high FODMAP vegetables, there are some low FODMAP vegetables. There's no way I would comprehensively give you the list in this episode, and it would get boring, so I'll just give you a few examples. So cauliflower is high FODMAP, mushrooms are high FODMAP. They have different FODMAPs in them. Cauliflower has mannitol and mushrooms have mannitol. Other high FODMAP vegetables, let's see, snap peas have excess fructose. So they have different ones. Onions and garlic have fructans. So those are a few examples of some of the high FODMAP vegetables. Low FODMAP vegetables, surprisingly, broccoli is low FODMAP. I'm even shocked about that. Green beans, carrots, yellow squash, zucchini. There's lots of wonderful low FODMAP vegetables. Lots of our salad vegetables, lettuce, tomatoes are low FODMAP. Fruits. This is a sad food group. Most of our fruits, like stone fruits, are summer fruits, peaches, nectarines, cherries, our apples, our pears, our high FODMAP, but low FODMAP fruits include melons, like not watermelon, watermelon's high FODMAP, but cantaloupe, honeydew, other low FODMAP fruits include oranges, kiwi, berry, not all berries, blackberries are high FODMAP, but strawberries and blueberries and raspberries are low FODMAP. And all of the fruits have a limited portion. So they will become high FODMAP over a certain portion. Not all high FODMAP foods have a limited portion, but all the fruits do. So this is another thing that the Monash app will help you tease out. As for other food groups, in the beans, the legumes category, we discussed that earlier. So basically, all of the legumes and beans are considered high FODMAP, but there are a couple caveats. So you can have the garbanzo beans and the lentils are the ones that have been tested, and they're low FODMAP if they're canned, drained, rinsed, and eaten in a quarter cup portion. So that might sound annoyingly nuanced, but it's actually really helpful, especially if maybe you're a plant-based eater and or a vegetarian and you're really looking for any possible ways to add protein to your diet. That can be really helpful because you can add a quarter cup of roasted chickpeas to your salad and give you a protein and fiber boost. And a quarter cup is a decent amount if it's a salad topper. So the nuts and seeds food group, this one, pretty much all of them are allowed, but in limited portions, except for cashews and pistachios. But all of the others, peanuts, almonds, walnuts, pecans, pumpkin seeds, sunflower seeds, those are allowed, but they're in limited portions, like 1 or 2 tablespoons, depending on the food. The Monash app will help you with exactly how much for each of the different things. And these serving sizes are per sitting, they're not per day. So any of those serving sizes in the Monash app, the limited servings on fruit and nuts and some of the other foods, it's per sitting. So you could have half a banana in the morning, although now I think a whole small banana is allowed actually. So that example is out of date, but you could have 1 serving of, let's say, almonds in the morning, and you could have another serving in the afternoon. And for other food groups, now if we're talking about dairy, different dairy products have different lactose contents. So the more liquidy a dairy product is at room temperature, the more lactose it contains. So milk and ice cream and yogurt have a and cream pretty much have a significant amount of lactose, whereas hard cheese and butter, so we're not talking about cheeses as soft as ricotta or cottage cheese, those still have a pretty good amount of lactose, but hard cheese and butter are virtually lactose free. Great news. And with grains, pretty much it's the gluten grains that give us a problem. And it's actually not because of the gluten, surprisingly, it's because of the fructan in those grains. But thankfully, it aligns with the gluten content. And so that makes it easier from a practical perspective to go with gluten-free foods. And that way you're steering clear of wheat, barley, and rye. One important thing to note, though, for people with celiac disease, where you have to avoid every last trace of gluten in anything, just be aware that the low FODMAP diet, because we do avoid those gluten grains as grains in foods, it's like over 90% gluten free, maybe even more than that. But it's not 100% because with the low FODMAP diet, we're not caring about maybe some gluten-derived ingredients like malt flavoring and things like that. So just be aware that you can't be guaranteed just because something's appropriate for the low FODMAP diet, it might still have some gluten ingredients in there. So you have to watch out for that. The next thing I want to talk about is how do you make this doable? How do you make this practical? Because this is such a specific diet. They're very specific foods to eat in very specific amounts. It's enough to make you crazy. And if it weren't for today's technological tools, I honestly don't know how. Well, we would just have to be super basic with it and we'd have to make everything ourselves, but it would be very difficult. So I have some tips for you to make this much more streamlined and easy. I've shared some of them already. There's my 30-day low FODMAP meal plan and grocery list if you just want to hit the ground running and follow a blueprint and not have to think too much about it. There is the Monash app, which is a quick handy in your hand food search. There's the Spoonful app, which you're going to use to search and scan grocery products so you don't have to spend hours reading labels and cross-referencing with your Monash app. But what else can we do to make this easier and more practical? Focus on more whole, unprocessed foods as the basis of your meals. So think about your meals in terms of lean proteins, rice. So maybe protein, starch, and vegetable, the old-fashioned meal framework. And look at it that way as the starting point. Most protein foods, all protein foods actually, any meat, poultry, fish, or eggs are naturally low FODMAP. And if you get them in their whole form, meaning they're not processed with other things, then you're going to be good to go. And then rice and potatoes and maybe gluten-free pasta and quinoa, make some really corn tortillas. Those are some good basic starches that you could build a meal around. And then you have plenty of low FODMAP vegetables that you can have. So from a most basic perspective, if you follow that framework, your meals will be pretty simple. Now, what about flavoring? Okay, so flavoring, the biggest problem with flavoring with the low FODMAP diet is honestly onion and garlic, because if you go out and get any sort of marinade or sauce or salsa or seasoning blends, most of them will have onion and garlic in there as an ingredient. And onion and garlic are very potent FODMAPs, even in very small amounts. This is one of the main issues that makes the diet the most challenging. But now we have many ways to help mitigate this. So the first thing you could do is just use simple seasonings. Like pretty much if you just look in your pantry, pretty much all the seasonings in there, unless it's a pre-made seasoning blend. So if it's like a steak seasoning or a ranch seasoning, things probably going to have onion or garlic in them, but like your basic spices are fine, your single spices. It's just those blends that would have onion and garlic. Every other spice is fine. So that makes it a little simpler. If you have enough cooking knowledge that you can go straight to your spice cabinet and use those. Maybe you like those seasoning blends because you're not a chef and you don't really know what to pair with what. So if that's the case, you're like, hey, just throwing on my seasoning blends. There is a company called Fody, and it's FODY, and you'll go to fodyfoods.com, although they do stock their products in lots of different grocery stores. And they have a solution for this issue. They have a bunch of different products in these different categories. They have seasoning blends, everyday seasoning blends, a few different kinds. They have a few different salad dressings. They have a few different marinara sauces, a few different salsas. They have a chicken soup base and a vegetable soup base. And all of their products are low FODMAP, free of onion and garlic, free of honey and molasses and any other FODMAP. So it's a wonderful way. I just love Fody because you can take your same old happy family meals and swap them out for a Fody product. And that way you're not completely starting a whole new diet with all new recipes. That is an option, but maybe you just want to make some tweaks to your current way of eating. Maybe it can be more friendly to your family, if you have other people eating with you, more friendly to yourself if you're just used to eating the food you love and you don't want to make big changes. So some examples you could do, let's say your family has taco night and your kids, they all really love it. And I hear patients tell me, I have to make a meal now for them and make a separate meal for me. And I don't like to hear that because I don't want you to do that. And so much of the time we can avoid that. So in this example of the tacos, you could just use the Fody taco seasoning because where you're going to find the FODMAPs in a taco meal, let's go through the ingredients. We're just going to use this as an example. Let's see, taco night, we have ground meat. You probably put a taco seasoning in there. So instead of the standard taco seasoning that has onion in it, you would swap it out for the Fody taco seasoning. And Fody is not the only way to do it. There are online recipes. You can find recipes for homemade taco seasoning and just omit the onion and garlic. That's what I used to do before Fody. I would just blend together my own seasonings. And you could do this with any seasoning blend. So let's say you have a steak seasoning you like. Well, you could go online and find a recipe for a homemade steak seasoning, put the seasonings together from your spice cabinet, and then just keep it in its own little baggie. And now that's your steak seasoning. You just left out the onion and garlic. So you could do that. You don't have to buy a specific product. But the Fody just makes life a lot easier. So that's why I'm mentioning it. So you would swap out the taco seasoning and then maybe you make a rice. You could still make rice. You'd have to be careful of what you add to it. One of my favorite tips is to use the green part of scallions to flavor your food with a little bit of onion flavor without the actual white part of the onion. So you don't get the FODMAPs that way. You can also use garlic infused olive oil. So you could use that maybe in the rice. You could just make plain rice. If you wanted a little tomato in there, you could do tomato, maybe some garlic infused olive oil, and maybe some green part of the scallions to add a little kick to it, maybe some chili pepper or just white rice. And then taco shells would be fine. They're corn based. You could do lettuce, tomato, cheddar cheese, all of that's low FODMAP. So there's your taco night. And maybe you could even use a Fody salsa because most salsas you'll find have onion, but Fody does not. So there you go. Let's use one more example. So let's say your kids love spaghetti and you guys have spaghetti once a week. You could swap out your regular spaghetti with gluten-free spaghetti. And gluten-free spaghetti is actually really, it can be very good, especially the gluten-free pastas that use corn and rice together. I find those have a little more body to them and they're a little bit more similar in their texture and how they hold up in sauce. Although people have different preferences, I do recommend trying a few different brands if you're not familiar with gluten-free products, because they can taste very different. They can have very different ingredients, because what happens with a gluten-free food, the gluten version, the regular version of a pasta is going to be just straight white flour, which is the same thing as wheat flour. It just doesn't have the wheat shells on it. So it's still wheat, but it's white flour, and that's basically the only ingredient in regular pasta and the main ingredient in regular bread. And when they make a product gluten-free, they're usually combining multiple different other flours and starches that are based from things like rice, corn, lots of different ancient grains they might mix in there. They might mix in starches like potato starch, corn starch. And so you get this Frankenstein thing that not necessarily is bad, but they're trying to make it as close to what we're used to as possible. And there are just some wonderful gluten-free products out there, that some genius formulations. So try some different things, because any two gluten-free products are not created equal. You could have one that's made completely from rice, and then the next one could be made from completely different ingredients. The one thing I would caution you against with the low FODMAP eating style is none of the chick pastas. So they should not be chickpea based, or I should say legume pasta. So no chickpea based, no lentil pastas. Watch out for those things, because those will definitely be high FODMAP, but anything corn or rice based. So go for the pasta. And then sauces you can use. So Fodi has a few different marinara sauces, and there's also Prego and Rayo are two brands that I know have a sensitive sauce, and the sensitive sauce is free of onion and garlic. So you have pasta, you have sauce, maybe you mix in some chicken or ground beef or ground turkey into that sauce, and then you could have, I don't know, a salad on the side or some steamed broccoli on the side with either just oil and vinegar, or maybe a Fodi salad dressing or a homemade low FODMAP salad dressing. So those are some examples of how to modify your go-to recipes to make them low FODMAP. And I have a first week on FODMAP, family friendly meal plan. It's just a week-long meal plan, but it has some of these swap type things that I'm talking about. So that's all kind of new recipes. If you're interested in more family friendly, just basic things, we'll put that one in the show notes as well. All right. The other thing that's going to help you be successful is to be prepared. I do recommend setting aside some time each week to plan your meals and make a grocery list. And then consider doing some batch cooking of staple ingredients so that you can assemble meals. And so you're going to want to pick a time of the week to plan. I recommend making that a different day than when you grocery shop. That way, if you're running behind, it can get to be a lot in one day. If you sit down, maybe you have 1 hour to do your grocery shopping, but you haven't even planned it yet. So then by the time you plan everything, you don't have time to grocery shop. So I recommend, let's say Friday, maybe you think through what you want to eat for the next week and you make a grocery list. And then maybe on Saturday, you do the grocery shopping. And then on maybe Sunday, you prep some vegetables. Maybe you cut them up and put them into individual baggies, make a big batch of white rice. Maybe you cook up a bunch of chicken breasts, and then maybe you could repurpose those ingredients to some different meals throughout the week. So maybe you could make the chicken breast into a salad one day and mix it into a marinara sauce on the next day and make it into a stir fry on the next day. So that's a system I recommend to help keep you on track and just make things easier. And sometimes the more basic, the better. And keep in mind, this is a temporary phase, and you're going to be adding a lot more foods in down the road. So this isn't forever. If you need to keep it extra basic just to get through this part of the process, then that's totally fine. Another thing to watch out for is sneaky high FODMAP ingredients that can make their way into packaged foods. Now, this is not any food brands trying to be sneaky. These are just ingredients that could be easily overlooked. And again, the spoonful app will help you to identify these, but this could be things like fiber additives like inulin. FOS is fructooligosaccharides. That's a common fiber additive, or chicory root. There can be high fructose corn syrup added to foods. There can be sugar alcohols like sorbitol and maltitol, xylitol that can be high FODMAP. So there's just lots and lots. The list goes on of things that can be in foods that you might not have recognized, because if you're just thinking in terms of whole foods, you got a 1 or 2 page handout from your doctor, you wouldn't even necessarily know that those ingredients are high FODMAP, and yet they can be significant enough to really cause symptoms. So definitely watch out for those. And then when dining out, that's another area where you want to be careful. Dining out can be very challenging with any special eating plan. It's not just the low FODMAP, but with low FODMAP, because one of the biggest hurdles is the onion and garlic and even wheat and dairy, then it can be challenging to eat out and navigate around those hurdles. So one tip is to keep your ordering as simple as possible. So order plain meat or fish, try to get it unseasoned if possible, steamed veggies without a lot of seasoning, and try to order rice or potato, like a steak and baked potato unseasoned is a perfect thing to order when you're out. And there are other ways you can do salads. You can try to do plain pasta with some olive oil and Parmesan cheese. So there are different things like that you can do, but it's just not any fun eating out when you're in the low FODMAP elimination phase. So you do the best you can. I do have a low FODMAP fast food guide that gives you some options you can order at different fast food places and different fast casual places. So I'll put that in the show notes as well to help you navigate those things. But another tip I have is to pick up some FODMAP digesting enzymes. So there are digestive enzymes, which are generally enzymes that you would produce in your body, like protease, amylase, lipase. That's your typical over-the-counter digestive enzyme. That's not what I'm talking about. FODMAP digesting enzymes are products like FODMAP, or you can pick up some Beano and some Lactaid, which will give you coverage at least for a couple of the different FODMAPs. So those are things you can take when you eat out. It's not a license to eat a bunch of high FODMAP foods because there's a limit on how much it can cover. But those type of enzymes, they actually break down the FODMAPs before bacteria can get a hold of them and start fermenting and causing symptoms. So again, it's FODMATE, FODMATE. That's a product that has multiple different enzymes that address multiple different FODMAPs. And if you don't have FODMATE, or if you don't have a lot of time to order it, you could alternatively grab some Lactaid, which would cover the lactose. And Beano, the name is targeted toward beans, but it also helps to break down fructans like onion and garlic and wheat. So it can be very helpful as well when you're dining out, because typically, as I said, dairy, wheat, and onion and garlic are what you're going to trip over the most. It's easier not to order a plate of refried beans and things like that. So those are some tips for dining out. I would also highly recommend tracking your progress. Track your symptoms before you start, as much information as you can, because these things take time. We're talking about a weeks-long process, and even months long if you count in the reintroduction phase. So it can be hard to remember how you felt 3 or 4 weeks ago exactly. So keep really good notes about how you feel before you start the process. It can also be helpful to keep a journal. I know Monash has a food record within the app. There are many different ways to keep a food journal. There's many different tracking apps. There's paper and pen. So whatever works best for you, note taking in your phone. Keep track of what you eat and your symptoms. That can really help as well to sort out what's causing what and what works better than other things. And do enlist support. It's not easy to undertake a whole new eating style, and just even to deal with all the things that come along with figuring out your triggers and dealing with symptoms. So it can be very helpful to utilize the help of a dietitian like me, or someone local, a local practitioner that you have access to, or to find support in your community, whether it be an online forum, a Facebook group, your friends and family, somebody, maybe a single buddy, but somebody that can help you or at least listen and be there for you. But it can be very helpful to have professional support, and I highly recommend that if it's possible for you, because there's a lot of nuances to this. And let me just explain why a little bit. It's very common. I see that people can tend to over restrict, because even though you have plenty of foods on the low FODMAP eating plan to choose from, people tend to zero in on the ones they're most familiar with, comfortable with, and that's easiest for them. And they tend to eat much less variety than they actually could. So a dietitian can help you to build a varied diet that has a lot of different variety with ideas of how to incorporate foods that you may not have thought to incorporate in a palatable way. And again, so like my 30-day low FODMAP meal plan is a great way to get some of that insight for well-balanced meals that are healthy, that are also low FODMAP. So that's a good resource as well. But we're concerned about making sure that on this elimination phase, you're getting enough nutrients, you're getting the protein you need, you're getting the other nutrients you need, and that you have a well-balanced diet. The other reason you would want to seek support is it's very common, especially when you see the tremendous results of symptoms calming down, to want to stay in that elimination phase. I see that a ton where people are nervous to venture out into the reintroduction phase. And it makes perfect sense. Here you've eliminated a bunch of foods that were causing you trouble. And so here you were having trouble, lots of different miserable symptoms. You eliminated a bunch of foods and you feel better. So your brain's going to tell you, I don't want to eat those foods again. But the problem is, to stay in the elimination phase too long can set you up for nutritional deficiencies. And it also starts to just chip away at your good bacteria diversity, because you're going to starve out your good bacteria in your gut too. And ultimately, that can make your gut more sensitive. So it can actually make things worse in the long term. Now, if you're nervous to venture into the reintroduction phase, we will talk about this in the episode that we're going to do soon on the reintroduction phase. But a first step, maybe an intermediate step, if you're not ready to reintroduce, make sure that you're working up to 30 different plant foods per week within the low FODMAP framework. And you can easily do this. As I went through the groups, in each food group, there are foods that are allowed, that are low FODMAP, plenty of foods, and some of them are in small amounts. But if you piece together these small amounts here and there, you can build up to that 30 different plant foods per week. And so just to give you an example, we're not talking about large amounts. It could be a tablespoon of beans here. It could be a teaspoon of ground flaxseed there. So it could be a snack bar that has like 10 different grains and seeds in it. There's 10 for your week. So while the 30 initially sounds really intimidating, it doesn't have to be. You can mix 5 different nuts in a baggie and 5 different dried fruits in a baggie and just put 1 tablespoon of each on your oatmeal in the morning. And right there, bam, 11 different plant foods. So in small amounts, I have my veggie mash recipe that gives you 10 to 15 different vegetables in 1 tablespoon. So we're talking about small amounts, but we're talking about diversity, and anyone can do this even when you're in the elimination phase of the low FODMAP diet. I'll add the veggie mash to the show notes as well. So you guys are going to have a lot of resources from this podcast episode. We'll talk about this in more depth next time, but what if you're not seeing full symptom relief with the low FODMAP diet? So that's when you definitely want to explore more what are your root causes. So in that case, I recommend seeing a practitioner. So we do this in my practice. We order SIBO testing and in many cases, comprehensive digestive stool analysis to guide our nutrition and lifestyle interventions. And in most cases, we're doing some amount of gut rebalancing, bacterial rebalancing to finally get symptoms calmed down and to get you back to being able to successfully reintroduce FODMAPs. And if you have a local gastroenterologist, they will usually order, most of them now are able to order a SIBO test, so I would request that. And they won't do the comprehensive digestive stool analysis usually, but you could find a naturopath or a functional medicine practitioner if you'd like to explore that avenue. But I would explore what's going on. Those are the 2 functional tests that I recommend for a full functional GI workup, to explore, why am I having these issues? Why am I so sensitive that even on the low FODMAP elimination phase, I'm still having issues? And then we do see that once those issues are rebalanced and cleared, now you go back to tolerating the FODMAPs and we're able to successfully reintroduce foods, which is exactly what we're going to talk about in the upcoming episode. So stay tuned in the next few weeks for that one, and make sure to download the meal plan and maybe some of the other resources that I'm going to put in the show notes. Bye for now.